right before 1451, when Jesus is being arrested, okay, he's basically like, oh, you're coming at me like a common, like a laistace, like a bandit or thief. You cannot go to Pontius Pilate. It's like, look, you or I couldn't go to the governor's mansion and try and just like run up to the front door. We're gonna get arrested, or worse, maybe, right? So Joseph Arimathea is like fairly important, but he isn't that important. Welcome to Two Truths, where we explore controversial topics in religion, philosophy, and history from at least two different perspectives. I'm Dr. Darren Iammarino, and today we're going to be doing part 2 on the Gospel of Mark. And I am going to be doing all the Gospels after this one. So we left off at the end of part 1, somewhere around chapter 7. And that's where we're going to pick it up here. And as a reminder, not really going through comprehensively looking at a lot of different verses. The idea here is to highlight some of the more intriguing or controversial verses and give a different take on it, right? Or look at it from multiple perspectives. So if we start with chapter 7, verse 15, we have Jesus stating that it is what comes out of a person that defiles, right? Not so much what you're putting in the sense of food, let's say. This is interesting because think about what he's really saying here. He's basically stating that the whole kosher dietary law situation that's so familiar at that time and still even today is borderline irrelevant, right? It's what you say, and which is a product of your heart and your mind, right? Your voice and what you project out to the world is really sort of a window into your soul. Far more than if you choose to eat, I don't know, this meat versus that grain type of thing, right? So it doesn't seem like that major of a saying or a quote, but it's a very, very important quote where he's essentially doing a 180 on the whole system of the time. And it gives you also a picture to why a lot of people are going to dislike him, because that's not something that's a popular viewpoint at the time. Is definitely going to get you in trouble suggesting something like this, right? So that's chapter 7, verse 15. If we move forward and go into chapter 7, verse 34, and even chapter 8, verse 22, you have these examples where Jesus is curing people. There's a lot of that in the Gospel of Mark. But in these cases, it's unique because he's using like a combination of like putting his fingers in someone's ears and then using spit, right? Which is interesting, very magical sounding, to cure people who are deaf or blind. Now, there might be something to say if you really wanted to make a major stretch here on a biological case. The whole idea, the phrase like licking your wounds, I mean, there's a reason why that's a saying. There is something to be said about like the fact that in like saliva or mucus, it can create these like white blood cell nets that sort of usher out bacteria in a novel way. So there's that. But obviously, I don't think that's what, in any way, what we're supposed to be understanding here. It's a more spiritual situation where in the first example in chapter 7, verse 34, where he's dealing with the deaf man, he also makes a statement, a phrase that means to open up, but it has a dual meaning. It's like he's trying to open up the man's heart on one level to God's healing powers, and also open up the cosmos, like the heavens above, to sort of like bring in this healing. Because the terms, if we looked at the Greek that's used around in chapter 7, verse 34, it's basically meaning like to connect or to be revealed, that's what's happening. You're sort of like opening up a connection to the divine. in this way. So not a whole lot really to say there, just that it is interesting that it has this more like magical almost connotation where you're using fluids, right? Bodily fluids to affect a cure of some kind or to connect to the divine in some manner. So that's what I've got to say on that. I mean, there's certainly very strange forms of even like therapy that today would sound crazy, where you would be using, like, not to take us on a totally wild tangent, but there are fecal transplants and stuff that are done today to cure you of certain conditions, right? To reestablish like your certain like microbiome or whatnot. So who knows? There's a lot of interesting stuff that could be said there. But let's move on to another topic. Chapter 9, verse 35 and chapter 10, verse 44 are basically, they're very similar in terms of what they're focusing on. Here's the general quote. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant even of all. In 1044, it's going to say slave of all, which is a pretty strong statement there. And I'd like to point out that some of the more recent popes, I would actually argue almost all of the recent popes, the last sort of, including the new current one, I guess, we could say the last 4 have actually been pretty good. Doesn't really matter if you're a Catholic or not. Generally speaking, I think that the last 4 popes have understood the Bible quite well. When you compare it to, say, a Renaissance pope like the Borgias, and how messed up and depraved they were. So to give a specific example, Pope Francis, believe, when he came to the United States, he said at one point that, he's not a rock star, because some people kind of gave him this image, and that's not what he is. He's the servant of the servants of God. So essentially what he's saying is like, I'm the lowest, right? I'm here to serve everyone else. And in doing so, it demonstrates his proper understanding. He is the top, though. He's the Pope, right? But in so doing, he should be, right, the servant of all of the people. So that's just a more recent, maybe, example of how these, like chapter 9, verse 35 and chapter 10, verse 44, have been put into effect by the leader of at least the Catholic Church. Now, moving on, something quite different, kind of bringing in marriage now. Chapter 12, verse 18 through 27, there's a really bizarre, kind of interesting story where sort of the Sadducees, scribes, Pharisees, all these like groups are arguing against him, as they do, and they're giving Jesus this account of like, let's say that someone's married, they die without children, and the law of Moses, you're supposed to, as a brother, marry that wife and try and have children. But what happens if you go through multiple brothers and the woman never has children and they all die eventually, right? Like, who is she supposed to be married to in heaven of all these different brothers? And Jesus is like, what are you talking about? Like, you don't understand the Bible. You don't understand the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. You don't understand God. And he effectively states that in the coming kingdom of God, really there is no one's married. No one's married. No one's getting married. And instead, you're sort of admonished to, I guess you could say, live the life of the angels, because that's what it's going to be like. So that sort of begs the question as to what that is. And it seems like it's more of a asexual, probably androgynous almost scenario, where you're married to God is the point, right? All the focus should be on connection to God and worship of God and all of that. And it's not about a scenario where you're now only like connected to one person, right? You're in this full community. But a little like kind of underlying thread here is it almost seems like this chapter and verse gives some evidence that Jesus is not married. I mean, he wasn't. There is zero evidence that he is married. But this kind of line suggests that it's like, hey, ideally you could be living this way now. Paul says the same thing. Paul's like, hey, get married only if you have to, rather than falling into a bunch of lust or something, right? But like marriage isn't ideal, even in this realm, which is a weird shakeup when you think about this, because matrimony is a sacrament, right? So why all of this like kind of, it's not like it's anti at all, but it's not a strong pro marriage situation coming from Jesus or coming from Paul. So what's really going on there? And I think that's the answer, is that, in the coming age, that's not how things are going to be, and it's not relevant at that point. Now, to give a little counterpoint here, if we want to go into some of the Gnostic Gospels, mainly the Gospel of Philip, there is this statement that like Jesus would frequently kiss Mary Magdalene on the blank, and there's like a hole in the text. Mouth is what's generally agreed as to what would be in that little hole in the text. But that doesn't really prove anything one way or the other. Certainly wouldn't make you married necessarily, even if it were happening. Now, on this notion of kind of like weird relationships and Jesus, this takes us to highly controversial chapter 14, verse 51. Now, on some podcasts, like I think like was Danny Jones' podcast, he's had this guy Amon Hillman, a definite intriguing character with more of kind of like a Satanist twist or trickster kind of vibe. And he's heavily focused on this particular passage because there's two things that happen in this. Right before 1451, when Jesus is being arrested, okay, he's basically like, oh, you're coming at me like a common, like a laestace, like a bandit or thief. But people like Amon Hillman are saying like, no, that's a term for like a pedophile. Maybe, but there's a huge broad range of meaning for this term. So there's no reason to narrow it to that. He's probably trying to focus on that. One, because it's highly provocative. Two, because in 1451, we do have this bizarre account. And it is bizarre, where all of a sudden there's a naked youth, a young boy, young man, but really this term in Greek's more for someone younger, like probably like a boy or early teens or something like this. And he's wearing only white and he's naked underneath, and he kind of runs away naked because the linen cloth comes off. So what? What the hell is going on here? One thing I'm going to say is that I think it's very important to understand this verse in connection to another verse at the very end of the Gospel of Mark, which I'm about to get to, because a young boy, same term in Greek, wearing white, like this, probably this, maybe the same person that they're referencing here in 1451, comes up again. And you normally don't hear people discussing that. So we'll get to that. But what I will say at this point about this, regardless of your take on this, if you want to take this extreme stance like Amon Hillman has, it isn't just his. He's definitely getting this material from Morton Smith. Morton Smith was a very provocative scholar of biblical studies in the 20th century. He's extremely intelligent and knows a lot of languages, and was on purpose, like he would try to essentially irritate the other scholars in the community. So he was respected in one way, but not respected at all in some other ways, because of his constant attempts at trying to create scandal effectively. And he was very, very good at it. So one thing that Morton Smith essentially states is that he found a portion of what's called the Secret Gospel of Mark, written in an obscure form of Dutch, I believe, like archaic form, that conveniently Morton Smith is one of the only people that knows how to how to really read this, one of the few people. And he finds it plastered into the back of another book in some library. I don't remember exactly where he was, if he was in Sinai sort of library, wherever it was. But he finds this piece of the Secret Gospel of Mark, which references kind of this like initiation ceremony and like, I believe, like the wearing of the white linen, and Morton Smith tries to even take, I think, like a homosexual angle on it, which is what Amon Hillman's doing too, right? This like basically pedophilia sort of angle or whatever. So what I'm getting at is that who knows? Who knows what's going on there? Probably nothing. Maybe it is a young person they're trying to initiate into the group, but doesn't mean there's anything sketchy going on. But this whole type of claim has existed for a while, since like the 1960s or 70s. And I can tell you furthermore, this, my professor that I had in graduate school was the mentee of this Morton Smith and was there on his deathbed. And Morton Smith swore on his deathbed that he didn't make any of this stuff up, that it actually was there, the text, and because he's accused of fabricating this, and he swears that he didn't. But if you're a trickster personality, you're really gonna are you really gonna do a 180 on your deathbed? I don't know, probably not. So who knows? But that's that. Okay, I don't think there's any much more we can really say on it. Even by trying to like probe the Greek, I mean, it's not going to reveal a definitive answer for us. Let's fast forward. Let's move away from like the young boy thing and talk about some women instead. In chapter 15, verse 41, there's an interesting statement, which it says, well, there were many other women who came up to Jerusalem with Jesus, beyond the Mary Magdalene and other Marys that he knows. So that there's a lot of women, and they provided for him financially, is what the impression we're supposed to get. So pretty interesting statement there. And this is the time when all of his male followers are bailing on him because he's being crucified. So that's pretty interesting. Now, immediate post-crucifixion, chapter 15, verse 42 through 47. We have Joseph of Arimathea mentioned, this like new guy that kind of comes up out of nowhere. And the reasoning for that is that he is wealthy and he is a follower of Jesus. And you cannot go to Pontius Pilate. It's like, look, you or I couldn't go to the governor's mansion and try and just like run up to the front door. We're going to get arrested, or worse, maybe, right? So Joseph of Arimathea is like fairly important, but he isn't that important. But he's the best hope of a follower of Jesus trying to get his body. And he has a tomb. So there's this whole thing called the swoon hypothesis here. This is like the counter take, the people that are against Jesus. The claim is that he was not dead yet. He was unconscious. And that he was possibly even unconscious because of a drink, some sort of, I don't know what type of like hemlock, right? Type drink dosed properly that put him out, but not killed him type of thing. And that they take him off the cross and they get him into this tomb pretty quickly that's owned by Joseph of Arimathea. And then he's not dead. The resurrection is far less impressive if you were just like unconscious and brought back, right? And then, hey, look, I'm still here type of thing. So that's known as the swoon hypothesis. We'll see in my coming episodes when we get to like Matthew and Luke that they're going to do something to deal with this accusation. Mainly, they're going to claim there's guards at the tomb. Not mentioned at all in the Gospel of Mark, our oldest gospel. Nothing about there being any guards. Instead, what we have is the next thing, which is that basically the two Marys, Mary Magdalene, right, shows up, and they show up to the tomb expecting that it's going to be sealed still, but the tomb has, like, the stone has been rolled back, and who's there, right? Well, in chapter 16, who's there in this tomb? A young boy wearing white linen who's like, you're expecting Jesus of Nazareth or whatever to be here? No, he's risen. He's risen. He'll see you in Galilee or something like that. He's not there. But that boy is there again. It doesn't say it's the same boy as in 1451, but yeah, probably. I mean, it fits the exact same description. So, interesting. Because we'll note when we get to Matthew and Luke, that is altered. It's not a boy. It's an angel or angels. Right? They change it significantly. So interesting. And that's how the Gospel of Mark ends, with Mary Magdalene freaked out and not telling anyone about what she saw. It ends with chapter 16, verse 8. That's it. Gospel of Mark ends. Now you're probably thinking, wait a second, my Bible has more than chapter 16, verse 8. And that's because there's the shorter ending of Mark and the longer ending of Mark. But they don't exist. The two oldest manuscripts that we have, the Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, right? So in the Vatican and Sinai Peninsula, there's nothing. There is no additional text. So all of that is an add-on, and it's obviously an add-on when you read it. It doesn't sound the same voice. It's just an attempt to wrap up all the stuff that's missing. Because think about it. There's no appearances of Jesus post-crucifixion. There's no mention of like the virgin birth. Joseph is never mentioned, for example. There's like the Great Commission. There's just a lot of stuff that needs to happen that's in the other Gospels that's not in Mark. So they added on this longer ending. And I'll end this video with this because I think it's kind of intriguing. In Appalachian, right, mountains where they have the snake handling Christians, they will quote the Gospel of Mark 16, like the longer ending, because it talks about like being able to raise up snakes and, you're basically like immune type of thing. But that's not in the Bible. That's not in the original text at all. Anything about that. So just be warned. The Gospel of Mark ends 16:8. That's it. So I think for today, that's good. I'm going to wrap it here. And hopefully you like this one, and be on the lookout for the Gospel of Matthew, because there's going to be a lot to say on that one. All right, until then.